Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, a distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I am also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. Today's episode is entitled The New Crusades, Islamophobia and the Global War on Muslims, featuring Professor Khaled Beydoun. Professor Beydoun explains how both democratic and authoritarian regimes worldwide exploit Islamophobia to target Muslim populations. He examines the pivotal role of the American war on terror in amplifying and connecting anti-Muslim campaigns across continents, from Europe and Asia to the Middle East and beyond. Professor Beydoun's work provides a critical and intimate examination of Islamophobia's diverse manifestations. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that is the center of culture wars in North America, Europe, and Asia.
First book I was working on, American Islamophobia, came at the foot of the rising Trump administration or the Trump movement before he became president, as Islamophobia was becoming an issue of popular and discursive attention for the first time, at least in the United States, as a consequence of the rhetoric, the policy proposals, but also the broader culture of Islamophobia that was being, peddled and curated by the Trump movement. And obviously that really swelled into formal policy when he took hold of the White House, when he was elected, surprisingly by many, in 2016. So when that book came out, I started touring the book. I was at that juncture a pre-tenured law professor, and some people thought that it wasn't the best idea to write a book of that kind while pre-tenured, but it was in line with the academic research I was conducting. And I thought that would be a good idea to sort of consolidate all of the academic work that I did into a kind of a cogent monograph. But in the process of touring that book in the United States and then progressively beyond the United States, I began to realize, track, and meet individuals and then subsequently interview individuals who were talking about Islamophobia beyond the American experiences, American experience in countries across Europe and places like Sweden, the UK, France, Spain, and Italy, where I toured the first book in the broader Muslim and Arab world in places like Egypt, where I am right now, Qatar, the UAE, Lebanon, India, Myanmar, and China. So throughout all these conversations with non-American Muslims, I began to realize how the American War on Terror project, which was always framed and envisioned as being a global project, and in the words of then President George Bush, a global crusade, and that sort of that language of crusading, has sort of a double entendre meaning, sort of hearkening back to the formative crusades, but then again, the language of clash of civilizations and crusading that Bush sort of made very central in his war on terror speech 9 or 10 days after the 9/11 terror attacks. Given that the war on terror was a global project, the book kind of functions with the foundational idea or thesis that the American war on terror either intensified pre-existing Islamophobic campaigns around the world, or in many respects initiated them. It abetted them by essentially, providing a language, a lexicon, a legal template for countries around the world to adopt not only the foundational baseline of what Islamophobia is, and there's various definitions. Professor Aziz has also grappled with this, but the foundational definition that I use in my research is Islamophobia is essentially the presumption of terrorism that is assigned to individuals who express some sort of outward Muslim behavior, whether through manifestations of dress, whether through behavior, or whether through religious expression, or even grooming, right? So the way in which you sort of carry out your everyday life, in the words of Irving Goffman, scholar of identity performance theory, is sort of the emblems, if you will, or the signals that invite the suspicion that, sort of creates this foundational understanding of what Islamophobia is. I break down that framework, the theoretical framework of Islamophobia, to talk about it in structural terms, in the way we understand institutional racism, that the state and non-state actors also carry out Islamophobia by way of hard law, formal policy, state action, presidential rhetoric, corporate institutional laws, customs. So Islamophobia is also institutional, but it's private in nature as well. Private meaning that it's carried out by citizens, individual actors, acting on behalf of the broader state or societal project of policing or punishing Muslims. And then finally, Islamophobia being a dialectic, sort of, injecting the work of Edward Said, this broader epistemology or discourse of anti-Muslim othering that ties the private action with the institutional action. So that was the theory I crafted in my academic work and that I adopted in the first book, and that I adopt and tweak to this third book to talk about what's happening with regard to Islamophobia on a global scale. And even though Islamophobia looks dramatically different in the various case studies I address in the book, there are some really salient foundations or pillars that track back to American policy that is extended and enforced by the war on terror. So I'll talk about those. I'll kind of try to crystallize what those are through my discussion of the various case studies. So the book centers on many case studies. I won't mention all of them, but I'll discuss some of the more, I would say, stark and concerning case studies. One of them being India, right? So in 2014, India, which holds itself to be the biggest democracy in the world and, has very established democratic institutions that are fortified by a secular constitution, is overtaken by Narendra Modi and the BJP party in 2014, who, in many respects, like Trump, ride the wave of racial and religious populism all the way to the highest office of that country's government. And as a consequence of their rise, they really engage in vitriolic anti-Muslim rhetoric as a way to mobilize and galvanize Hindu supremacist base that swells in line with them mounting their power over the course of their administration. And many of the tactics that were employed by Modi and the BJP were in many respects enabled and emboldened by the policies that were seeded by the war on terror, right? The notion that, and you saw the language of counterterrorism, the language of extremism, the language of radicalization that is very central in a lot of Western, British, French, but especially American policy that was being used circa the time that Modi was elected and then rose to power, being adopted and emulated by the Modi regime to carry forward policy that, again, looked a lot like what the United States was doing. Some of the laws that were enacted during his regime, I mean, the Citizenship Amendment Act was a central pillar of the structural Islamophobic architecture that was established by Modi. And the Citizenship Amendment Act, kind of follows in the spirit of the Muslim ban. The idea that individuals who are Muslim in identity would be preempted or prevented from becoming naturalized citizens. The only three nationalities that are identified in that law are Pakistanis, Afghans, and Bangladeshis, who are categorically denied the ability to become naturalized citizens on account of their religious identity. But what was more nefarious about the CAA was that it was also domestic policy. It wasn't only policy restricting naturalization. And there's interesting and Professor Aziz, I'd love your insight on this, maybe during the Q&A. There's some interesting parallels with the CAA, with the law that the United States had in place, the Naturalization Act of 1790, that we can maybe probe during the Q&A. But the way in which the CAA was also policing Muslim identity domestically is, many of you who study India or may study India may know that India has a very sizable indigent poor population, and a sizable portion of that poor population happen to be Muslims. And these Muslim Indian citizens oftentimes lack the documentation to prove that they're in fact citizens. So the CAA was enforced also as a way to strip citizenship from bona fide Indian Muslims on account of them not being able to provide the actual physical documentation that they were citizens. And that was, in my opinion, one of the objectives of the CAA from the BJP, because they knew that a considerable segment of Muslims across the country on account of indigence or rurality, couldn't produce this documentation and could eventually strip. The BJP and the government at the time was controlled by the BJP, would be able to strip them of citizenship on account of assigning them with the presumption of foreignness, that they weren't bona fide citizens, but Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, or in extreme cases, using the language of terrorism to strip them of citizenship. In the way the CAA functioned, it worked in conjunction with other really diabolical or ominous laws that were part of the broader structural Islamophobic architecture being expanded by the Modi administration. And the other law was the National Registry, which took account of where Muslims lived, where Muslims of special interest who the state sort of tied sometimes with tenuous ties to terrorism and extremism, individuals who were engaged in dissent, journalists, student activists were placed on this registry. And once you were placed on the registry, then the mechanisms of surveillance functioned. And if you were placed on this registry and you're one of these individuals who lack documentation, then there's a high prospect of citizenship being stripped of you. The third sort of, and again, this might be the most frightening component of the Indian Islamophobic architecture, gradual development of this network of prison camps in an eastern province in India called Assam, which were effectively where were immigrants of Muslim origin, but also undocumented citizens would be placed en masse through a dragnet of policing that is enabled by the laws I just mentioned, but also additional surveillance laws that I hadn't mentioned. So that provides you with a snapshot of what's taking place in India. I had the opportunity to interview over 50 people across the country of India, the majority of them Muslims, who spoke, in candor about their experience. And the book, sort of the methodology of the book is legal analysis, but also integrating a lot of firsthand personal testimony by way of, interviews that I conducted to give the book sort of a multi-dimensional texture. The book is academic research oriented, but it's written in a way that I hope is accessible to a broad audience. So that's why I tried to not personalize, but inject a lot of personal narrative in the book to be appealing to readers who might not otherwise be sort of taken by the legal and political analysis provided in the book. Sahar and I are both critical race theorists, and we know that the power of narrative is a really strategic way to reel in the attention of readers. So that's India, and I qualify India as one of the more concerning epicenters of global Islamophobia. And once you move east, in China, another focal case study in the book is the experience of Uyghur Muslims. Through a lot of the activism I do and humanitarian work I do, I had the chance to meet with many leading Uyghur Muslim leadership in the diaspora, primarily in Turkey, where there's a large population in the metro Istanbul area. And that was really instructive, having those relationships, because I had the chance to interview a large number of concentration camp survivors, individuals who fled, young children who didn't know the whereabouts of their parents. The young woman on the cover of the book, her name is Muslima, 17-year-old. Well, she was then 17-year-old young Uyghur student living in Istanbul who hadn't spoken to her father since the age of 12. And the Uyghur Muslim issue was very attractive to me, and I was really keen on making it a centerpiece of the book, because scholars in this area know very well how this issue was, kind of overlooked, if not erased, for a long time by both international scholars, race scholars, but also more focused Islamophobic scholars within the academic discourse. It gained popularity in 2018 when the United Nations, finally exposed this network of concentration camps in what the Chinese government calls Xinjiang, or what the Uyghur Muslim people call East Turkestan. The Uyghur people their quest is for independence and self-determination. And as a consequence of that objective, the Chinese government has cracked down in the most dystopian, Orwellian terms, constructing, and again, this is all kind of fed by the fact that you have a governmental structure of authoritarianism that enables the kind of unchecked surveillance, incarceration, and in fact, barbarism that might be theoretically improbable in Western countries, although some contemporary case studies might suggest otherwise. So yeah, in East Turkestan / Xinjiang, you saw kind of the most concerning manifestations of structural Islamophobia, right? The most sort of stark and vivid would be these concentration camps, these prison camps where Uyghur Muslim mothers, fathers, teenagers, elders would be arrested, sometimes in the din of the night, they'd be collected from their homes without notice as to why they were being arrested. And then they'd be disappeared into these concentration camps for months, if not years. In the horror within the concentration camps has been documented by the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, things like forced sterilization of women, forced removal of hair, organ harvesting, very horrific torture tactics. There's something called the tiger chair, where you're sort of like placed into this like steel chair and your body's contorted in ways that are very uncomfortable as you're questioned. Those are the more sort of, violent forms of punishment that take place within the concentration camps. But there's also, I think, more, other modes of psychological conditioning that take place within the camps. For instance, there's a forced sort of divestment of Islam that is imposed on individuals. You have to sort of like swear that you're no longer going to, believe in the religion, forced sort of memorization and singing of communist slogans, communist jingles, forced consumption of pork and drinking of alcohol. So in addition to physical punishment and violence, these concentration camps are also spaces and systems of intellectual and psychological reconditioning that are designed to sort of, when the individual is released from the camp, theoretically from the vantage point of the state, is that they become sort of communist loyalists and then deployed back into their communities, oftentimes as data gatherers, spies, snitches, in the same way that, we understand that language in the countering violent extremism analog here in the United States, Canada, and the UK. But beyond that, you also saw very violent forms of ethnic cleansing, the razing and destruction of very ancient mosques. It's important to remember that East Turkestan is home to many long-standing and ancient Muslim communities. So these mosques oftentimes are 6, 7 centuries old. The state would raise them. They've destroyed this is a long time ago because I haven't really focused on this issue, but up to 30 mosques throughout the province/territory. They would also criminalize fasting during the holy month of Ramadan. So for the Black Mirror fans, you guys watch the show Black Mirror on Netflix, great show. We're kind of living in Black Mirror, sort of a Black Mirror phase in some respects right now. But heavy surveillance on phones. So the state, and you guys all know that the social media platforms are dramatically different in China. They're state-owned, right? So they don't have Facebook, Instagram, and X. They have their own Chinese analogs of that. And the state is able to not only pierce the phone, but have complete surveillance control over the phone. So something as innocuous as, let's say, me or Sahar, if we were hypothetically living in Xinjiang, if we were looking at a Quranic app that sort of signals when it's time to pray, or an app that, features one of our favorite imams reading a verse or reciting a verse, that would prompt the prospect of the state surveilling you. And oftentimes it functions along with a different algorithm, like where you travel to, who your friends are, which mosque you go to. But that can feed this broader algorithm that triggers suspicion and then arrest. So heavy phone surveillance. And again, this is an authoritarian state, so there's no civil liberties protections or privacy expectations on the part of people, enabling a mode of structural Islamophobia that is all-encompassing. And again, I use the term Orwellian because it really demonstrates what structural Islamophobia feels like. And there's kind of a blurring of private and structural Islamophobia in a place like China, because oftentimes the private individuals who engage in Islamophobia are directly linked with the Communist Party and are oftentimes spies, loyalists, or authorized private policemen tasked with monitoring the activity of the individual. So that's China. And I write, far more extensively about the various laws and programs that take place that crack down on the Uyghur Muslims in China. Another case study that I'll mention is one that's familiar to everybody, is obviously France, right? France, in many ways, I kind of think about it as the vanguard of global Islamophobia that was kind of ahead of the curve of the United States, sort of enacting, many of the early draconian policy that preceded the war on terror. So before France was successful in passing or enacting legislation that enabled the banning of the headscarf, it had that objective in the 90s, actually in the mid-80s and through the 90s, where it swelled. And then this movement to criminalize Islamic dress, policing women specifically. So this is where this whole idea and discourse of gendered Islamophobia comes into play, because the laws in a place like France are not only disproportionately impacting Muslim women, but oftentimes are intended to police Muslim women. And I'll just mention this really briefly. The gendered discourse of Islamophobia, I think, is most obvious in a place like France, where you see the law, policy, but also political rhetoric across the political spectrum, not only with the Front National, which is the far right-wing party, with people like Marine Le Pen, but now also the liberals and the centrists adopting a similar posture with regard to Islam. Macron, for instance, now has adopted much of the same rhetoric that the far right was peddling for many years. But you see the gendered Islamophobic sort of discourse being peddled in France, under this rubric that Muslim women were, and the way they're stereotyped is dramatically different than the way Muslim men are stereotyped. Muslim women are essentially, oppressed, lack agency, are forced by the men in their families, the fathers, the uncles, the brothers, to have to express their religiosity in very conservative terms, whether through the hijab or the niqab. And the state kind of uses that logic or illogic, whatever you want to call it, to pass policy that is paternalistic in nature, kind of driven by this idea that we have to liberate or save Muslim women from their oppressive, male interlocutors. And then the men, follow the way in which men are stereotyped, kind of follows the general course of Orientalist or Islamophobic epistemology. The idea that men are violent, warmongering, oppressive, patriarchal, and they inflict that collective violence first upon their most proximate participants or subjects, which are Muslim women. So before Muslim men can engage or inflict their violence on the world at large or on Western nations or Western institutions, they do so first upon their sisters, mothers, wives, and so on. So this is the sort of ideology driving much of French Islamophobic policy. You see this very starkly in the 2004 headscarf ban. And if you read the sort of like legislative record, you'll see the language coming from all sides. And this was passed unanimously, by the way. I think that by a 97% to 3 margin. Again, this whole notion that we have to pass a policy like this kind to westernize, assimilate, but more importantly, liberate Muslim women from the men. And then you see that policy being the foundation, being expanded by the niqab ban, right? The idea that face coverings, which is a conservative mode of Islamic dress for women, also being outlawed in 2011, I believe it was. The state then, introduced a bill that wasn't passed to restrict Muslim mothers who wear the hijab from being able to attend school trips with their children. Most recently, we saw how the abaya was banned this past year. Abaya is a free-flowing mode of conservative dress worn by Muslim women. Again, an indication of the religiosity being banned within public schools. Again, all of this intentionally policing women as the sort of corpus of structural Islamophobia. But beyond that, there are other forms. France had its own mode, counter-radicalization policing. And I think what's really distinct with France as a liberal secular democracy that enables this kind of a comparison with the American experience, where the law and the language of the war on terror sort of intensified French Islamophobia, but it did not initiate it because it was already well underway beforehand. But in France, for instance, there's this principle of laïcité, which is the enshrinement of secularism as being the prevailing religious ideology of the state. Secularism is essentially the religion of the state. So there's an establishment of secularism as the faith of the state, which enables a more piercing and penetrating and direct policing of Muslim identity in ways that are presumptively not possible in the United States, because either endorsement or castigation of any one religion would qualify as a violation of the Establishment Clause, even though Establishment Clause jurisprudence, as many of us know, is highly fractured with 10 or more tests that are employed across the courts in the country. So the French model is also really interesting to me because you see French Islamophobia being exported in the same way that American Islamophobia is exported into Francophone parts of the world. Belgium adopted a copycat headscarf ban. Quebec, the French-speaking province in Canada, adopted in 2019 a copycat headscarf ban. So what's really interesting about global Islamophobia is you see many of these former colonial states exporting their own brand of Islamophobia, onto their former colonies, France, the UK, and then obviously the United States being a distinct form of imperial power, being more forceful in its expansion of global Islamophobia through not only war on terror policy, but war, right? 2 wars, Afghanistan, the illegal war in Iraq, but also on the domestic front with a host of laws that we can talk about. I'll just make a couple of final remarks. There's a range of other case studies in the book. Obviously, what took place with the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, which was a really horrific ethnic cleansing project. I talk about what's happening in Sweden, delve into what's happening in the UK, India. Again, the objective of the book is not to be expansive with addressing as many global case studies as possible. What I try to do with the book in terms of selection of case studies is to identify a disparate and diverse set of case studies that I think in the West, in the East, in the Far East, in places beyond and in between, that really manifest how Islamophobia functions and looks distinctly, and oftentimes is a reflection of that country's history and that country's political system, but also to crystallize that there are overarching parallels that undergird all these systems and case studies of Islamophobia that track back to the American War on Terror, which again is the fundamental thread of the book. I will say this, I think that obviously the big elephant in the room is what's taking place in Gaza, and we can see how Islamophobia functions discursively to, essentially flatten the people of Palestine as a presumptively terroristic group based on racial and religious identity, especially when you juxtapose the Palestinian case study with Ukraine, right? And how race and religion in the Palestinian context sort of maybe not entirely prevents, but severely undermines the kind of rich, multidimensional, media-oriented, political, and definitely popular celebration of Ukrainian humanity in ways that have been denied the Palestinian people, not only during this crisis, but in crises before. So it's important to think about, and I haven't seen many people talk about this, Sahar, so I'm interested to see what you have to say about this, is how war on terror language, imagery, and presumptions of guilt sort of feed the demonization of Palestinian people in this current crisis. And you see that through, kind of the presumption of guilt. You see that through the condemnation of children as collateral damage. So there's an entire sort of lexicon that comes from the war on terror that I think is being reified in many ways in this crisis.
I have a couple of kind of broad questions that you touched on. The first is, there is this paradox that sticks out, which is that Islamophobia in liberal states exists, and Islamophobia in authoritarian states exists, but not in the same way. How do you discern between the political system of a particular regime, such as China, or, India proclaims that it's a democracy, Israel proclaims that it's a democracy, France proclaims that it's a democracy, and so does the United States. And democracy is not always the same as a liberal state. One of the takeaways from your analysis is that it is effectively global, but surely the political regime of the country does make a difference. And so what are the ways in which it makes a difference?
The political structure of the country or case study in question makes a considerable difference and oftentimes shapes the way in which Islamophobia is enforced, inflected, and then experienced, right? So in China, given that it's an authoritarian country, there is no political sort of heterogeneity in China, right? So the way in which Islamophobia is discussed in China is going to be dramatically different than, a France or the United States or a Canada, where the way in which Islamophobia is engaged by leftist versus conservative elements is dramatically different, right? In China, there's sort of a culture of obedience to state policy. And if the state sort of decides unilaterally that a specific segment of the population is tied to extremism and terrorism, then there's going to be no dissent, right? There's going to be no popular sort of opposition to that ruling because everybody is sort of either ideologically wed to the party of the state or too fearful to go against it. So that enables the lack of popular opposition, but also the structure of authoritarian regimes is to enable an unchecked and oftentimes, not oftentimes, but as we see in China, a brutal enforcement of Islamophobia that truly has no bounds, right? The fact that concentration camps can be installed and then expanded in the modern moment, in my opinion, is not possible. Like, we can't see an Islamophobic sort of system of that kind in a Western democracy, in my opinion, right? It's just not going to happen. Authoritarianism enables that. Authoritarianism enables you to arrest an individual who is a citizen of that country or a lawful resident without process, right? And we've seen after the war on terror sort of semblances of that in the United States, but not to their fullest extent, like we see in China. And then in the camps, you have, again, within the actual concentration camps, really, morbid manifestations of violence, right? Which would be violations of, various constitutional elements in Western democracy, checking cruel forms of unusual punishment. So even though we have semblances of that in Western countries, they don't reach the degree that we see in authoritarian states. So beyond structures of government is also the two things that I think are worth mentioning are geographic proximity and a country's historical sort of engagement with Islam in the Muslim world. So in France, for instance, right, in France, there's a far more longstanding, entrenched proximity with the Muslim world, but relationship with the Muslim world. So in many respects, Islamophobia in France is a lot more nuanced, advanced. A French Islamophobe in the private context has a greater knowledge of what Islam is and what Muslims have done historically than what an American might have, right? And much of that, is triggered by, in the French instance, one of the most brutal colonial experiments in modern history, which is that of Algeria, right? So that experience of Algerian colonialism or colonization has bred a literacy of Islam that feeds modern notions of Islamophobia. The American experience is really interesting, right? Because it's also fed, like Orientalism drives, both sort of misepistemologies of what Islam is across Europe, but also in the United States. But Islam is, rather a kind of a novel or an unknown commodity in the United States. Even though enslaved Africans were Muslims at the inception of this country's history, Americans, as a consequence of geography in the United States being a relatively young nation, don't have the developed, multidimensional, deeply rooted relationship with Islam, which is good and bad news, because the bad news is it can give rise to the, abrupt rise of very vitriolic Islamophobic movements like we saw with the Tea Party first, which foreshadowed Trump, and then it reaching full scale with Trump. But the good news is you can presumptively sort of erode and unmake that kind of Islamophobia in the United States in ways that I don't think would be as possible in a place like France, like UK or the UK or Spain or Italy.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.